So welcome to those who've just arrived. We're going to get started. And before I introduce myself, I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I would like to acknowledge that the land on which Sheena's Place gathers and virtually gathers is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, and the Indigenous peoples have lived on and cared for this land for more than 15,000 years. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Treaty. Today, Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We acknowledge that those of us who are settlers on the land directly benefit from the process of colonization. We also understand that although land acknowledgements are a first step, reconciliation requires significantly more work. We encourage you to check out something called the Indigenous Ally Toolkit, which was created by the Montreal Urban Aboriginal Community Strategy Network last year. And a link will be provided to this in the chat, so you're welcome to check that out by clicking the link and opening that and then checking it out after the webinar. So again, welcome to those who are arriving now. My name is Kaitlyn Axelrod. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a social worker and the program and outreach coordinator at Sheena's Place. And I'm here with my colleague, Kelsey. Well, do you want me to introduce you, Kelsey? I can do that. So Kelsey is a social worker as well, the program manager at Sheena's Place. She also uses she, her pronouns, and she will be here as tech support today. So if you have any questions at all about technology or anything like that, please feel free to send a chat message to Kelsey. You'll notice that in the chat, you're able to message the whole group. So if you do have any questions throughout, please do that. Don't message me directly because I may not see it. So please message either Kelsey or the whole group, and we'll make sure that your questions get communicated and passed along. In terms of some housekeeping items, you are welcome to turn your video off or have it on. It's really up to you. And I will ask that everyone keeps their audio muted. And you can unmute if you would like to ask a question at any of the sort of allotted question times. So you can ask a question in the chat at any time, and then if you'd like to ask it out loud, you can do that when I ask if there are questions throughout the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel. For those of you who just arrived, just know that your names and your video squares will not be included in the recording. So it's really just my screen and my voice. So I really appreciate you all taking the time to be here virtually today. I am going to be talking about how to cope with the current COVID-19 situation with a focus on managing stress and our relationship with food and exercise. I am also navigating this situation, so I by no means am an expert on mental health during COVID-19. So we're all working through this together. We're all at different stages or phases in our lives. I also want to acknowledge that this webinar is for information and education purposes only, and it's not a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. The content in this webinar is not intended to describe everyone's experience, and we know that everyone here knows what's best for them and what will work. So please take from the webinar what makes sense for your own situation in life. All right, so if there are also any issues with your ability to see the slides, please just send a message to Kelsey and she will communicate that to me. Even though I've used this platform many times now, I'm still figuring it out. Somehow things are changing every day. So here's a brief overview of what we'll be covering today. So I'll start with a brief overview of Sheena's Place and my role there. I'll then provide some context and education about stress, eating, and movement from an eating disorder informed perspective. And I'll then go over some recommendations generally about mental health and then also more specifically about food and movement. And at the end, we'll provide a list of resources. Hopefully there will be time for questions at the end. If not, everyone should have my email through Eventbrite, so you're welcome to send me an email with any additional questions that you have. So for those of you who are not familiar, Sheena's Place is a community mental health charity that supports people with eating disorders, including body image issues and concurrent mental health challenges. We offer a wide range of professionally facilitated groups and workshops to anyone age 17 plus, so people with eating disorder experience and also family, friends, and partners of those individuals. We offer 5 main types of groups, including support groups, expressive arts groups, skill building groups, body image groups, and nutrition groups. And as a result of COVID-19, we've pivoted to online groups. So right now, everything we're doing is online. We have just started our summer season this week, and we are currently offering 17 weekly online groups. Most are currently full, but if you do have questions about registration, you can get in touch with us by phone or email. All of our programs are free of charge, and an eating disorder diagnosis is not required to attend. So we are the only agency in the GTA to provide such low barrier services for eating disorders. My role at Sheena's Place is to facilitate groups, now virtual groups, and to provide presentations and trainings to a variety of audiences, including medical and mental health professionals, university students, elementary and high school students and teachers, and community members. And this is Sheena's Place, if you have not been there. It's a big, old, and homey house, so it's not a clinical environment. All right, so I'm going to start by talking about some of the basics when it comes to stress. So when we encounter a change or a new demand, our bodies automatically prepare to respond. So this occurs through the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, also known as the fight or flight system. And the fight or flight system instructs our adrenal glands to release the hormones epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline, and cortisol. And the release of these hormones is what causes many physiological changes. So you can see some of those listed on the left here. Our heart beats faster, breathing rate increases, muscles tighten, digestive processes change. We may have heightened awareness and an increase in energy. Once this imminent danger has passed, our body then usually returns to its unstressed state through activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, also known as the rest and digest system. So you can see some of the effects there on the right. So this type of short-lived stress is critical to our survival. Evolutionarily, it prepared us for fighting predators, and still today, it's important because it keeps us healthy by avoiding accidents and keeping us motivated when we encounter challenges. However, if stress persists over time, the hormone cortisol continues to be released, and this can have negative consequences for our health, including high blood pressure, sleep problems, type 2 diabetes, osteoporosis, mental cloudiness, and a weakened immune system, as well as depression and anxiety. So a lot of things can happen if we do experience prolonged chronic stress. When it comes to stress, it's not a linear relationship in that, the least amount of stress is the best and the most is the worst. So it is a bell curve like this. So having no stress at all is not always great because we actually do need a little bit of stress in order to stay motivated and, like I said, avoid accidents and stay healthy to a certain extent. So this yellow zone here on this graph shows our optimum stress level. So this allows us to experience just enough stress that we're motivated. If we don't need to be completing any tasks or doing anything, then we're okay to be in this green zone if we're just resting. But generally, we do want to be in this yellow zone for a lot of our lives. However, as you can see, if stress increases over time, we move into this orange and red zones, and this can then cause many negative consequences, as I mentioned. So I think most people can relate to the feeling of having a little bit of stress that is motivating and that feels productive, but then also having so much stress that it becomes overwhelming and it is no longer helpful and it can be quite detrimental. So I really want to emphasize that stress is a normal biological reaction to a potentially dangerous situation. So it's really understandable that many people around the world are currently experiencing stress due to the threats and uncertainty associated with COVID-19, as well as with increased news coverage and discussions of themes like police brutality and anti-Black racism. So when it comes to stress responses, it's important to know that everyone responds differently to stress, and different events or situations provoke stress in different people. So there's no one size fits all formula here. So knowing how stress shows up for you as an individual is critical, because if we know how stress shows up for us, we can then work towards reducing its negative long-term effects. And I don't mean that we're in control of everything that causes stress. So there are many, many external factors that are beyond our control that will cause stress and some of these impacts. But if we can recognize how stress shows up for us, we can at least work to mitigate some of the negative consequences. So I just want to take a moment and have everyone read this graph. And here are some examples of how stress may show up for a person. So again, everyone's different. So we have how stress shows up in the body, emotions, the mind, and in behavior. So how we actually respond. So I'll encourage everyone, I'll just mute myself for a minute or so. And if everyone could just take that time to think about how stress shows up for you. So when you're stressed, what happens? And you're welcome to write that down or just think about it. So when it comes to the emotion section, I sometimes find that it can be hard to think about what all of the different emotions are and to try and recall those. So something that can be helpful is looking at a list of emotions or an emotion wheel like this one. So this lists a lot of emotions. It's not meant to be overwhelming, but this is a tool that can be really helpful when it comes to labeling our emotions. And that step is something that may sound simple, but it can actually really help reduce the impacts of stress. So again, with this webinar being recorded, you will have access to these slides. You're also welcome to Google emotion wheel, and something like this will pop up if you're interested in looking at it further. So I'll pause here. Does anyone have any questions so far? All right, I'm going to go through one more slide and then I'll pause again to see if anyone has any questions. So we're going to take a brief moment to talk about immune function and stress. So I'll preface this by saying I am not a doctor or a physiologist. I am a social worker. So this is a very basic overview of how stress can impact our immune system. So stress, of course, can compromise the immune system, and this is particularly important to remember in the face of a global pandemic. So stress hormones affect immune cells in a variety of ways. Initially, stress actually helps us fight invaders and heal quickly after injury. However, chronic stress can dampen immune function of immune cells and make us more susceptible to infections and slow the rate at which we heal. So then when we're sick, we may encounter additional stress. So for example, if we have to take time off work, we may then encounter financial stress, which can then perpetuate this cycle over time. So as I mentioned earlier, many stressors are systemic and are beyond our control. So my goal here is not to make anyone feel badly for experiencing this cycle. It is unfortunately very common, and things like, racism, homophobia, transphobia, fat phobia, and poverty are all things that can impact this that we may not have any control over. So I'll pause one more time here before I move on to the next section to see if anyone has any questions about stress. All right. If you have any questions, you can ask them at the end as well. So I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about eating disorders. So just as a warning, I will be mentioning some diagnoses and symptoms. So if you would like to step out for a moment and return in a couple minutes, that's fine. Otherwise, just know that I will be speaking about those things. So stress impacts all facets of our well-being, and given what we do at Sheena's Place, it's important to focus on how stress affects eating and exercise. So again, the situation that we're currently facing can be particularly challenging for people who live with eating disorders or disordered eating symptoms. And I'll just give a brief overview of what eating disorders are for anyone who may not be clear on that. So eating disorders are a type of mental health challenge that refer to an unhealthy relationship with food in the body and reflect often an attempt to cope with an individual context. So common symptoms of eating disorders or disordered eating include restricting food intake. That includes extreme dieting, binging, so that means feeling a loss of control while eating a large quantity of food, purging, so that means an attempt to compensate for a binge eating episode through various means. So for example, self-induced vomiting, laxative or diuretic misuse, medication misuse, excessive exercise, or fasting. And eating disorders are incredibly common. So approximately 1 million people in Canada meet the diagnostic criteria for an eating disorder, and many more people experience symptoms. So you can see here that eating disorders do occur on a spectrum, like all mental health challenges. So everyone here falls somewhere on that spectrum. Everyone in the world falls somewhere on this spectrum. So if we look at the middle section of what is called disordered eating, this would be symptoms. And then if you look on the far right, if a person were to meet a certain list of criteria of symptoms, then they may be diagnosed with an eating disorder. So those include anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder. Those are the three that we talk about the most at Sheena's Place, but there are additional diagnoses. And if you're interested in looking more into that, you can check out the DSM. I do just want to emphasize that many people face challenges with eating and with body image, but who do not meet the criteria for an eating disorder. So many people fall in this middle area of disordered eating and still require treatment and support. So a diagnosis doesn't make someone more deserving or worthy of treatment. So that's why at Sheena's Place, we don't require a diagnosis for folks to access our services. I also want to mention that a lot of the behaviors in this middle section of disordered eating are quite normalized in society, so particularly dieting for weight loss and excessive exercise. And so this can make it really difficult to identify when something becomes problematic for a person. I also just want to mention that all types of people experience eating disorders and disordered eating symptoms. So contrary to popular belief, eating disorders are not a young, thin, white women's illness. Certain groups who don't fit into that category are actually more likely to develop an eating disorder. So that includes people who are living in poverty or experiencing food insecurity, as well as folks who identify as LGBTQ2S, particularly trans and non-binary folks. So it's a very brief overview of eating disorders as a whole. If you're interested again in learning more about the specifics, there will be resources at the end. So when it comes to COVID-19 and eating disorders, we know that eating disorder symptoms are increasing for many people, and this is reflected by increased call volumes to organizations like Kids Help Phone and the National Eating Disorder Information Center, as well as anecdotal information from the groups that I facilitate at Sheena's Place. So increases in eating disorder behaviors are very understandable given the circumstances that we're currently facing with COVID-19. So I have here just a few of the reasons or themes for why these two things may be connected. This, of course, doesn't describe everyone's experience, but these are some themes that are commonly coming up. So I'll just touch on each one briefly. So coping with a feeling of a loss of control, given the context, COVID-19 is presenting a lot of uncertainty. And so it makes sense that folks may want to exert control over some aspect of their life, like food or movement. Loss of structure and routine. So structure and routine can be very, very helpful when it comes to recovery and staying on track with things like a meal plan. And so when our routine is changed, it makes sense that we may experience an increase in symptoms. Isolation is big, of course. So we know that feelings of loneliness often precede symptoms like binge eating. And isolation can also impact co-occurring mental health challenges like depression or anxiety, which then can affect the eating disorder. Increased isolation also means less accountability with food and meals for many people. And on the other hand, living with other people can also cause, a lack of privacy, leading to maybe more feelings of being out of control and connecting to symptoms in that way. Decreased access to support. So this is especially true for marginalized folks. So maybe people who can't access the internet. And that's, for example, all that Sheena's Place is offering right now. So this is an equity issue that's exacerbating pre-existing problems and pre-existing inequities in our society. Discussions about food scarcity and hoarding can also be particularly challenging for folks who deal with an eating disorder or disordered eating. So this can lead to, for example, binge eating because a person may fear that a certain food will not be available later on, or on the other hand, restriction or guilt around eating in an attempt to save a resource that is perceived as not being maybe available later. And I know that these discussions about food scarcity and hoarding have diminished over the last couple of months, as was more prevalent at the beginning of COVID-19. But for many people, these fears and discussions are still happening. Conversations about a fear of weight gain and pressures to exercise can also be very triggering. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And lastly, compromised immune function. So while there's no current evidence that people with eating disorders are more likely to get COVID-19, we do know that many folks with eating disorders have compromised immune function. So if we think back to how stress impacts immune function and that relationship, then we may see a connection here. Okay, before we move into the recommendations, does anyone have any questions about anything that I've covered so far? All right, I will move along then. So the first set of recommendations that I'm going to cover are related more directly to food and exercise. I'll get to that comic soon. It's one of my favorites when we talk about number 5, I believe. So the first recommendation is rest. There can be a lot of pressure to use this time in quarantine or lockdown or however you want to put it as productively as possible. And while engaging in productive activities can be really important in keeping us motivated and developing our self-esteem, we need to remember that rest is also crucial. So, watching Netflix, listening to music, having a nap, and practicing good sleep hygiene are all really important things to do, as well as all of these other things that we may be pressured to do. Similarly, there may be a lot of pressure for some people to be engaging in exercise or doing home workouts as much as possible. But I want to remind you to listen to your body. So, perhaps that means challenging yourself to move in a new way. So maybe you'd like to try something new that's outside of your comfort zone, but trying to do so only when it feels good to do so. Remember too that when our sympathetic nervous system is activated, so when we're experiencing stress, our heart rate is often increased, and therefore addressing this type of stress with vigorous exercise is likely not the best idea, as we would like to lower our heart rate instead in order to cope with that stress. So maybe that means engaging in more calming activities. Lastly, remember that stress lowers immune function, and so now more than ever, it's important to be taking care of our bodies by resting. The next recommendation is around social media. So unfollowing social media accounts that make you feel badly about yourself. And this can be easier said than done. I know that there are can be a lot of, you know, drama, for example, with unfollowing a friend, if that's someone who is making you feel badly about yourself. But there are some ways to get around that through muting and blocking and doing creative things. So research does show that looking at photo and video based social media increases a person's likelihood of developing negative body image and self-esteem, which then puts someone at an increased risk for developing an eating disorder, depression, and anxiety. Most of us are probably spending more time on social media right now than we were before COVID-19, simply because there are fewer things to do. And so I'd encourage everyone to just consider, you know, when scrolling through Instagram, for example, do you come across a photo that makes you feel badly about yourself, and noticing that and seeing if there are any actions that can be taken, for example, unfollowing that person in order to help cope with that, and know that that can make a big difference. And, you know, replacing that content with other content that's less related to bodies or food. So, for example, more dog accounts. I think that I love dogs, but I think that everyone could use more dog or pet accounts in their Instagram feed, personally. Let me see, do we have a question here? Nope, okay. So next, when it comes to food, and this one is a very, very hard one because of the messages that we receive so frequently in our lives. So avoid labeling food as good or bad. Remember that food in itself has no moral value. So the type of food that we eat does not determine the type of person who we are. This can be very hard to unlearn because, as I mentioned, we are constantly bombarded with messaging around food and what kind of food, you know, connects with what type of person we are. So remember that the messaging we hear about food is often flawed. You know, for example, good, quote unquote, good foods or healthy foods are usually expensive. They may ignore many cultures' traditional foods and dishes, and are often reinforced as healthy due to special interests in marketing. These messages can also be quite confusing and change regularly. So an example I like to use is around milk. For the longest time, milk, like cow's milk, was promoted as, you know, really like the healthiest thing, especially for kids while growing. And then we all of a sudden saw soy milk coming in as the healthier alternative. And then we saw almond milk coming in, and now we're seeing oat milk. So there are so many different factors at play here, and it's not as simple as, you know, what's good or healthy. Remember too that fad diets and foods have existed for over 100 years. And basing our food decisions solely on what foods we think are good versus bad can have a lot of negative consequences. So we may experience feelings of guilt about eating certain foods. We may stop listening to our body's hunger and fullness cues, and we may develop poor body image and self-esteem. So something that we recommend through outreach presentations at Sheena's Place is to consider thinking about food in a different way. So whether that's, you know, you can create the mantra that works for you, whether it comes to balance or no food is a bad food, all foods fit, or thinking about food as always food and sometimes food. So always being the food we need to eat every day to meet our nutritional needs, and that varies person to person. And then sometimes food being the food that we really like, or we may really like eating, and that we should still eat. But if we were to only eat that food, we may not be meeting our nutritional needs. So this is where the comic comes in. I think it's a really interesting example of how we talk about food and kind of putting that into perspective around, like, does eating cake really make me a bad person? Does that logically make sense? Not really in the context of the alternative provided here. So next is to learn about something called the diet binge cycle or the restrict binge cycle. And knowing that restricting food intake often leads to binge eating. So I'm going to switch to another slide for a minute while I discuss this. So some of you may have seen this on our social media or on other learning or social media platforms. And I'm going to just go over kind of how it works and what it means. So before I do that, my intention is really not to shame anyone who is currently on a diet or who has tried one in the past. There are so many reasons why a person might intentionally diet or unintentionally restrict their food consumption. So I just want to mention that. I'm also not talking about small dietary adjustments here. I really mean major changes like cutting out entire categories of food or significantly reducing caloric intake. So dieting often begins as a result of living in a world where people are told that they need to lose weight in order to be healthy. And dieting or restricting may also begin as an attempt to gain control, when a person feels like they're not in control. So for example, with COVID-19. Restricting food intake can also begin for reasons beyond our control. So for example, lack of access to food. So when a person goes on an extreme diet or restricts their food intake for whatever reason, they will then usually experience food cravings and a feeling of being out of control around food. So this is the body's way of telling us that we should be eating more or more variety of foods. This can then cause a person to engage in binge eating. So again, eating a lot of food and feeling this loss of control, which then is often followed by feelings of guilt and shame about maybe like not being good enough or not having enough willpower, or feeling like they failed the diet or that sort of thing. And then you can see how this cycle can really continue over time with then wanting to gain control again. I really want to emphasize here that binge eating is a very normal biological response to restricting or dieting. The body cannot tell the difference between intentional dieting and unintentional restriction. And so it's one of the ways in which it's trying to keep us healthy is by engaging in binge eating or feeling out of control around food. So we also know that dieting doesn't work long-term for the vast, vast majority of people. And this is because of something called set point theory. So just like we're all different heights and we have different sized features like hands and feet, our bodies have a set point, so a range when it comes to size and weight that is primarily determined by genetics. So if we try to change this by dieting, our bodies will fight back. So if we start going on a diet and we may initially lose weight and move below our set point, but as soon as we move below our set point, our body will do everything it can to fight back and to get us back up to our set point range. And so that includes those cravings, thinking about food, binge eating, as well as changes to how we actually process food. So our metabolism will slow down, the body will absorb as much nutrients as possible from the food that we are eating because it thinks we're experiencing a famine, so it's trying to protect us. So this means that over time our set point may actually increase, but it won't decrease. So this is why research shows that diets can actually lead to long-term weight gain rather than weight loss. And importantly, set point also naturally increases throughout the lifespan. So someone's set point range when they're 65 is going to most likely be higher than when they were 20 years old. And that's very normal, despite what society may tell us about aging. I see a question here. How do we know what our set point is? That's a really good question. And there's no like scientific measurement to figure that out. But essentially your set point is the weight that you sit at, that you are at when you are eating in a way that's intuitive and moving in a way that feels good for your body. So I know that answer can be quite frustrating because it's not numerical or quantitative, but it can be really hard to know what our set point is, especially if we've been engaging in like dieting over time and experiencing a lot of weight changes. But essentially, if we're not dieting and not binge eating as a response, and we're eating in a way that, we're listening to our hunger cues, we're eating when we're hungry, stopping when we're full, more or less, there's flexibility there, and then moving in a way that feels good and isn't excessive or isn't, totally sedentary, that then our body will sit at its set point. And again, it is a range. So our weight does naturally change, throughout the year, depending on stress and other things that are happening. All right. Are there any other questions about the diet binge cycle before I move on to our last point about food and movement recommendations? Okay, so back up to here. Lastly, under this section, a recommendation is to avoid making jokes or comments about weight. So many of us have probably seen the memes and jokes circulating about weight gain during COVID-19. And while the intention of these jokes is usually not malicious, they can be incredibly harmful. So physical distancing means that our habits are going to change. We may not have access to the exercise or movement we were doing before this time. We may be eating more of certain foods due to their availability and also due to stress. So for some people, stress leads to an increase in appetite, and that's normal. So our weight might change, and that's totally fine. The reason for that is that weight is not an accurate indicator of health. So contrary to, again, messages that a lot of us have received for most of our lives, according to more and more research, we know that a person's health is not dependent on their weight. Health is so much more complicated than that. So genetics and socioeconomic status are two of the strongest predictors of a person's health status. A lot of studies may show a correlation between a certain weight and certain health outcomes, but remember that correlation doesn't equal causation. So there are so many mediating factors that do mediate this relationship between weight and health. So the framework that, if you're interested in learning more about that, it's called Health at Every Size, and I will have some more resources about that at the end if you're interested. Know too that these comments or jokes about weight gain or fear of weight gain reinforce weight stigma. So weight stigma meaning the discrimination against people in large or fat bodies. Research shows that weight stigma is actually more dangerous to a person's health than the weight itself. So people who experience weight stigma are more likely to experience depression, anxiety, and eating disorders, and are also less likely to engage in physical activity and visit the doctor. So as I just mentioned about mediating factors, weight stigma is one of these mediating factors. So while someone who is in a higher weight may be more likely to develop negative health consequences, one of the big reasons for that is the experience of weight stigma, not the weight itself. Also something very worth mentioning, and I really encourage you to look further into this if you're interested, is that weight stigma and fat phobia, so another name for a similar concept, is largely based in anti-Black racism and religion, not in health, as is commonly believed. So in the early 19th century, during the transatlantic slave trade in the US, body size was used as a way of othering Black people and as a way of creating hierarchical race divisions. At the same time, Protestantism was encouraging abstinence from a lot of pleasures, including food, so like the sin of gluttony, that's where that comes from, and weight was linked to morality. So as a result, thinness was seen as desirable, and this was about 100 years before the medical establishment started to become concerned with quote-unquote obesity from a health perspective. So not all communities, of course, view thinness as healthy or desirable and fatness as unhealthy or undesirable. However, even communities who do not subscribe to these values are often affected by those who do. So for example, the medical community. So this information is all based on a book by Sabrina Strings called The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia, Fearing the Black Body. I said that backwards, but that is in the resource list at the end if you're interested in learning more. I see some chat messages. I'm just gonna quickly read these and see if I can answer them now or if I'll wait. So we have one question that says, so can the cravings leading, so this is back to the diet binge cycle. The cravings leading to overeating happen only at a particular time of day, say afternoons or only at nights, or should it happen all the time? Okay, so that's an interesting question about when those cravings that I mentioned in the diet binge cycle may occur. So often people do experience binge eating or those feelings of cravings or being out of control later in the day or at night, especially if they've been restricting all day long. So that makes a lot of sense that by the end of the day, a person may be more likely to engage in binge eating. It really depends on the person though, so depending on sleep patterns and so many other factors. And then the next question I see is, what recommendations do you have to support someone who is showing concerning symptoms of disordered eating, but does not recognize it as an issue? That's a very good question. I'm going to answer that at the end if we have time, and if not, I will provide some resources about that specific question. Okay, any questions about weight stigma, fat phobia, before we move on to the next set of recommendations? Oh, good question about set point. So would set point be different than BMI? I know there's a lot of controversy around BMI. Yeah, so set point is definitely different than BMI. So BMI is a measure that's used by a lot of medical professionals to determine what would be considered like a normal weight. But the BMI was actually developed for a very specific person, so particularly a non-athletic white European male. And it was never meant to be used as a diagnostic tool. It was meant to be used as a way to just measure populations, but still based on this very specific type of person. So understandably, you know, doctors and other medical professionals always want like an easy diagnostic tool to determine if someone is healthy or unhealthy. So unfortunately, BMI has become this diagnostic tool. However, it's not an accurate way of knowing if someone is healthy or not. So a set point for one person could be something that's considered underweight according to the BMI, and someone else's healthy set point could be something that's considered obese according to BMI. So it really is not an accurate way of measuring health. There's a really great article about the history of the BMI. I don't think it's in the resources, but if you Google racist history of the BMI, it should come up in Google. All right, so I'll move on to our next set of recommendations, and this speaks more generally to overall mental health, so moving away from food and exercise. So when it comes to the news, you know, this is a hard one, again, easier said than done, but being intentional with news consumption. So if we remember the fight or flight response, the sympathetic nervous system, the brain is continuously seeking new informational cues to reassess threat level. So if we bombard ourselves with details related to COVID-19 and headlines and images, we may actually reinforce the threat signal and perpetuate the stress response. So I think it can be really hard to find that balance between being informed and then being overwhelmed, and that can relate to any issue, so not just COVID-19. And so finding that balance for you is important, and again, it's going to be different for everyone. Making sure too that news sources are credible. There's a lot of fake news circulating. I've, you know, fallen for some of that without knowing. I think we all have, and so knowing that not everything we see is factual. And setting time limits can also be a helpful strategy when it comes to news consumption. So doing that, you know, with your phone or getting creative in that way. The next one is focusing on what you can control, not what you can't control. So this is very hard. We have this graphic here to provide some examples. With this though, I want to acknowledge that controlling food and exercise, as I mentioned earlier, can become a way of coping with not having control over other things. And so trying to see if we can maybe frame that differently. So instead of trying to control like what we're eating or quantity of what we're eating, maybe seeing if we can control like what recipe do I make tonight, or who do I have a social distancing meal with or a Zoom meal with. And so trying to find ways to assert control in a way that's going to benefit us more. And same goes for movement or exercise. So are there options that are going to be beneficial? Next, acknowledging our thoughts and feelings. So this may sound simple, but in times of stress, it's human nature to try to avoid our negative feelings or difficult feelings and thoughts through escape or distraction. It makes a lot of sense. However, this rarely works, and it often has the opposite effect. So if we try to run away or suppress thoughts and feelings, they usually end up popping back in an even more overwhelming way. So just taking time, like moments throughout the day to check in with yourself about how you're feeling, is really important, and know that whatever it is, however you're feeling, feeling is valid. So there's no wrong way to feel. And by acknowledging our feelings in this non-judgmental way, we're actually practicing mindfulness, which has been shown to help reduce stress and improve health and well-being. So mindfulness isn't just, there's a stereotype that mindfulness is about like sitting cross-legged in a really peaceful place, like meditating. And while that might be a form of mindfulness, can be as simple as just like thinking about what I'm thinking about, or acknowledging the emotion that's coming up for me using something like the emotion wheel that I mentioned earlier. Next is around breathing and posture. So again, this might sound simple, and no one likes being told to just breathe when they're feeling stressed. That can be very invalidating. However, many of us, myself included, spend a lot of our days engaging in very shallow breathing and even holding our breath without realizing it. So deep breathing slows down the sympathetic nervous system and circulates oxygen, thereby decreasing some of the effects of stress on the body. So deep breathing is very important, and posture is also related to that. So I'd like everyone to try something. If you could, everyone slump down as far as you can, like curl your shoulders over and really just slump over. And now try taking a deep breath. Okay, and now sit up straight with your shoulders back, and now try taking a deep breath. So I bet most of us can feel the difference between those two, right? It's a lot easier to take a deep breath when we're sitting upright compared to being slouched over. Studies also show that people who receive good news while seated in an upright posture have more pride and esteem compared to those who are slumped over. So this relates to how we interpret and receive COVID-19 news. So if we're hearing and watching the news while in an upright position, we may receive it better, so feel better about that information and not be as stressed out by it. So again, setting reminders on a phone can be a helpful way to do that. So number 5 here is to create routine and structure. I think many people have heard this recommendation from a variety of sources. This is really important, but remembering not to become too rigid with that. So finding some flexibility and balance. Maybe it's about planning like one thing a day. Maybe it's about trying to wake up around the same time each day, whatever time that might be. Meal time, so eating meals at regular times is really important as well in order to maintain structure and routine, and for many people when it comes to eating disorder recovery or just maintaining that healthy relationship with food. Number 6, setting boundaries. So this again, easier said than done. But if you find yourself talking about COVID-19 with other people constantly, consider asking to change the subject to something more lighthearted. I know that, as we progress through the situation, this may be a less relevant suggestion if naturally conversations are changing. But whatever it may be, if it's about, weight loss or topics that are not comfortable or not helpful to you, trying to set boundaries, whether it's by directly saying, I don't want to talk about this, or just changing the subject, or walking away. There are different ways to do that. Connecting with family and friends. So number 7, if possible, I think a lot of us are now experiencing Zoom fatigue, where we may not be making as much of an effort to connect with others, and trying to strike a balance. And so trying to still stay connected with people in any way we can, whether that's through a socially distanced in-person meetup or virtually. These things are still important, even though we're already, 3 months plus into this pandemic. In terms of boundary setting too, with people you may be living with, I know this can be really hard, but trying your best to find space for yourself and set boundaries with the folks you're living with. And lastly, getting additional mental health support if you need it. So I'll move on to some resources in a moment. I see there are questions here. Okay. So this question says, do you have any suggestions for not fixating on your body or body image? So much free time gives me a lot of time to think about how I look, etc. That's a really good question. So this is one of those cases when maybe distraction is helpful, right? So I had mentioned that avoidance or distraction of our emotions and thoughts can be unhelpful, but sometimes distraction can be helpful if we do find that we're spending a lot of time thinking about our body and body image. I think too, when it comes to social media, that can be a really important avenue to make some changes. And so noticing, like, when do those negative body image thoughts come up? Is it when I'm scrolling through Instagram? And kind of playing like scientist on yourself and becoming curious about when those things happen, and then using that as information or as data to then try to see how you can make any changes that would help with that. If anyone else has suggestions too around that question, please feel free to write them in the chat as well. Okay, so jumping off the last question, I have a lot of anxiety, but returning to work once everything reopens and ruminating/obsessing over thinking about coworkers judging quarantine weight gain. It feels silly, but constant. Yeah, this is something that's come up a lot in groups at Sheena's place, and I know other places as well. I think it's easy that anticipatory anxiety can really be very overwhelming, especially when we don't know what to expect and fears about others judging us. So, I mean, I don't have a specific recommendation for that, but just knowing that you're not alone in feeling that way. Reading more about health at every size, I think, can sometimes help with some of the feelings that we have around weight gain. It's still, we can still logically understand that weight isn't related to health, yet still feel the emotional impact of that. That's very real and normal. But again, if anyone has suggestions around that, feel free to write them in the chat. I think talking about those things out loud is a great strategy as well. So whether it's here, in a group at Sheena's place, in another forum with family or friends that you're comfortable discussing these things with. Okay, I see another question here about pregnancy. Sorry. So what I can say, so in terms of experiencing, body image challenges and disordered eating, pregnancy is a very common time for this to happen. So eating disorders and disordered eating are more likely to pop up at periods of transition. So whether that's transitioning from adolescence into adulthood, into college or university, pregnancy, childbirth, divorce, death, so major life events and transitions. Oh, thank you, Kelsey. So Kelsey just posted an article from NEDA, the National Eating Disorders Association in the US, related to pregnancy and eating disorders. So please feel free to check that out and know that you're also not alone in what you're going through. I'm going to go over a few of the resources in this list, and then I'll go back to that question about supporting a friend or family member who's struggling. So here are some general mental health resources. These are Toronto-based, but most of them can be accessed from anywhere. So some of them do have criteria, like Good to Talk is for post-secondary students, Kids Help Phone is for young folks, and so is Yorktown Family Services. But here are some resources that are worth checking out. When it comes to phone apps as well, some companies do have, for example, a subscription to Calm in their benefits plan. Also, apps like Calm and Headspace are offering free content as a result of COVID-19, and a lot of apps have free versions that are worth checking out. So some of those are about mindfulness, some of them are more based in cognitive behavioral therapy, but people find, I know a lot of people find these helpful. When it comes to eating disorder resources, I have listed at the top some treatment resources. So the first link, Ocoped, they on their website have a list of all of the publicly funded hospital-based eating disorder programs in Ontario. Many of them are reopening or offering virtual services, so please check that out. They do often have wait lists, but and strict eligibility criteria, but it's still very worth checking out. Virtual support is listed on the bottom half here. So Sheena's Place, as well as a whole host of other organizations offering versions of whether it's peer support, professionally facilitated group support like us, and support for specific populations. So trans folks fighting eating disorders, they have a Facebook group, and their website has a list of many resources. And then Nalgona Positivity Pride is specifically, they have a monthly support group called Sage and Spoon, which is free, and it's peer support for the BIPOC community. Here on this slide, we have more resources. So some articles and videos related to COVID-19 that I have found helpful. The next section, really, really great eating disorder resources. And then at the bottom, a combination of podcasts, videos, articles, and books about health at every size, fat phobia, and intuitive eating. So we have a few minutes, so I'll go back up to the question about supporting family and friends. NEDIC has a lot of really great information about this. So the National Eating Disorder Information Center, which Kelsey has just linked to in the chat. So they have a resource, a pamphlet that has recommendations for how to approach that person. So I don't really have time to go over all of those now, but I will try finding that resource and posting it in the chat, or if Kelsey, you know where that one is. I think it's called like a guide for family and friends. Essentially, in a nutshell, being patient and empathic with that person, focusing on the feelings rather than the symptoms themselves. If you see someone engaging in an eating disorder symptom, trying, after the incident has passed, so in a more calm and confidential environment, asking them how they're doing at a more emotional level tends to be more helpful than focusing in on the food or on the symptom. Here we go. Help for someone else. Thank you, Kelsey. And just patience, knowing that shame and guilt are emotions that often accompany disordered eating. And so preparing for, any possible anger or denial on behalf of that person, because these things, people do face a lot of stigma still when it comes to seeking support, especially if they don't fit into the stereotype of who is affected by an eating disorder. So just being open and non-judgmental and not making assumptions, since anyone of any identity or body size can face any of the eating disorder symptoms. All right, so it's almost 1 o'clock. Thank you all so much for being here today. I'm going to post one more link in the chat, which is a link to our evaluation. So we would be so grateful if everyone could complete that evaluation. It will help us improve our outreach presentations. You will also get this link in an email right at 1 o'clock after the webinar, and this will help us improve this content and make it more accessible. Oh, we have one more question.
Yeah, we just have someone wondering how they could get access to the eating disorder slides if folks are wanting to follow up on the resources.
Yes, that's a great question. So when we post the webinar on our YouTube channel, all of the slides will be there. I do know that they're hyperlinked, so it is nice to have the PDF. I will send the slides to all of the event attendees within the next few days, and you can access the resources that way as well. All right, thank you everyone. This flew by. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to send me an email. I'm going to end the meeting now, so thank you all very much.